Yeah, thank you, Celeste, and thanks also to the GGSA for organizing these lunch and learns. I think they're a great idea, and it's really nice to be here with you all and to see some real faces and positivity coming across the Zoom. So before I start, I'd like to acknowledge the territory where I'm currently located. I was born and raised here on unceded Algonquin Anishinaabe territory, and I'm now working and living here. And with that, I must also acknowledge the privileges that I have access to that have emerged from the dispossession of Indigenous peoples of this land. At the same time, I'd like to acknowledge the territory where we conducted the work that I'm going to be discussing today. And I'll be talking about two different regions. So the Inuvialuit settlement region, which is now in what we call the Northwest Territories, and Kluane First Nation, which is the territories located in the southwestern Yukon. So in terms of my research interests, they tend towards working in a collaborative way with northern communities to understand how they're affected by and adapting to environmental change. And more recently, my focus has been on food security and water security and how those link with Indigenous health and well-being. So as a researcher who works with northern Indigenous communities, it's ethically important to recognize the context of colonialism and to try to work in ways that are supportive of community interests and priorities. So this type of research relies on relationships, which take time to build and require ongoing commitment to maintain and sustain them. So through these relationships, one becomes aware of local interests and concerns, providing the foundation for the development of collaborative research projects. So today I'd like to try something a little different. I'd like to highlight some of the key research relationships that I'm engaged with and engaged in, and use those to illustrate the type of research that is made possible by those research relationships. So I'm going to focus, as I said, on two different geographic regions, the Inuvialuit settlement region and Kluane First Nation territory. So we'll start with the Inuvialuit settlement region, where I've been working with others on food security related research for much of the last decade. And just to provide some context, this is the Inuvialuit settlement region. It's the westernmost Inuit region in Canada in the northern Northwest Territories. There are 6 communities. So Nunavut is the administrative and business hub, and then there are 5 smaller, more remote communities. Primarily Inuit, or Inuvialuit is the local Inuit population. So in total, there's about 5,000 plus population in the entire region. Half of them, over half, live in Nunavut, and the other communities are quite small, from 100 people all the way up to 900 people. So these are really small remote communities where, you know, the population still relies quite heavily on hunting and harvesting from the land for their food sources. So the region is governed by the Inuvialuit Regional Corporation. So this was put in place at the signing of the final agreement, the land claim agreement in 1984. And so that Inuvialuit Regional Corporation, or I might refer to them as IRC, they have the governance mandate of improving economic, social, and cultural well-being of Inuvialuit. So they have a strong interest in helping to improve food security in the region. So for further context, there was an Inuit health survey conducted almost 15 years ago now that documented very high levels of food insecurity across Inuit Nunangat, or the Inuit homeland, the 4 Inuit regions across northern Canada, including in the ISR. So here we see that 46% of households reported experiencing some level of food insecurity, either moderate or severe, which is a rate that far exceeds the Canadian average. And primary reasons for this are, high unemployment levels, few economic opportunities, low incomes, high food costs, etc. So you say, well, these data are really old. They're from over 10 years ago now. But the reality is that they're the only data that actually document food security rates in the region. This is all we have to work with. There is a plan for a new Inuit health survey, a follow-up one, and sort of a perpetual kind of 5-year Inuit health survey for the future. But at the current time, these are the data that we have. And there are a number of challenges. So these are household level data, but because of confidentiality reasons, they're only reported at the regional scale. So we don't have a sense of local differences between communities in terms of food security status. So these data really highlighted the need for action and led to a research collaboration that continues to address multiple aspects of food security. So again, another note for those of you who may not have spent any time in the north, but Inuit diets are traditionally based on country food or wild harvested food, right? Things like beluga and fish and caribou. And over time and through the process of colonization, store-bought food has become more prevalent. And then to some degree, there's some local cultivation of some vegetables and in some cases small livestock in the region, but not very much. The food system really is based around store-bought food and country food at the current time. So we have to recognize the importance of country food culturally and for health as well. It's a bit of it brings in different complexities than we would experience here in in the city. So recognizing the food security challenges in the Inuvialuit settlement region, we created this collaborative research program starting back in 2012. We held 2 regional workshops to develop a basic understanding of the issues and challenges related to food security. And this spawned a series of projects, some more regionally focused and some more community focused. So through much of this time, we've been working primarily at the regional level. So trying to get a sense of how the region is working with its communities. And we've been engaging directly with a fellow named Julian McLean. And he was originally the regional dietitian for the ISR. And his job has evolved over time to encompass broader dimensions related to food security. So this research engagement at the regional level has allowed us to tap into a network of local nutrition workers in each community. These people, they all happen to be women, but they're hired on small recurring contracts to conduct cooking circles where recipes are prepared collaboratively and shared with community members. So Julian oversees these activities and offers periodic training to the nutrition workers. Well, so why am I telling you this? Well, these nutrition workers have actually been really exceptional resources and really helped to enable us to conduct research that we wouldn't otherwise have been able to conduct. So these nutrition workers have been engaged in all of sort of in food costing, in a harvest and sharing study, food sharing study in Pawlatuck, in a large community engagement process, and now more recently in this process that we're calling a project that we're calling C4FS. It's a community-based research project in Pawlatuck and Tuktoyaktuk. So what I would like to do is talk about a few of these examples just to help you understand how this relationship with these nutrition workers sort of through this regional conduit has really enabled us to do some interesting work that has been in response to the priorities indicated by the communities and by the region. So the first sort of project component, I guess, that these nutrition workers were involved with was a participatory market food costing study. So we know, some of you may know, that food prices are very high in northern grocery stores, but there's actually limited public data available from the retailers at the local level. And the prices of items on the shelf are known to fluctuate. We've heard that from residents. So working with the nutrition workers, we put together a project to document food prices and investigate the economics of diet quality and nutrition through a participatory food costing study. We worked with the nutrition workers, provided them extra training, and then they began to periodically document the prices of a list of 106 market foods in their communities beginning back in 2014. So they would go in with a list, a paper and a clipboard and check off prices. They would go and search for items and record prices and then send them back to us. And then we would go through the analysis and we would engage them in helping to interpret the data as well. The nutrition workers initially at the outset were also essential. They provided essential contributions to the development of the food list to make sure that it captured the dietary habits of their communities. So they've been involved in this process throughout. And what are some of the things we've been able to find? Just give you a few examples. For example, we were able to recognize that while food costs vary somewhat across communities, prices in the ISR are markedly higher than the national average for retail prices. For different items, they may be sort of between 41% difference and up to 470% difference in terms of the prices for frequently consumed products. I think the 470, if I remember correctly, it was for cola, for soft drinks. So that's one of the things that Northerners do consume quite a bit of, and the prices are exorbitantly higher than they are here. But regular food items that bread and milk and other products, we still saw this marked difference in food cost. We were also able to calculate the cost of meeting nutritional food serving recommendations. Health Canada puts out these nutrition recommendations, and found that the price of meeting that was exorbitant for many households, particularly considering limited employment opportunities and incomes. The results from this study also provide evidence of significant price differentials between energy dense, nutrient poor foods, so the cheap calories, the ones that give you sort of fat and sugar, but not a lot of nutrients, and more nutrient rich foods. And this favors a nutrition transition towards less healthful foods. So we can see here on this graph that the NRF here on the y-axis is a nutrition indicator, and so the higher you are up, the higher up on that axis you are, the more nutritional the food is, and then you have energy costs down at the bottom here. But so what we see is these larger bubbles here indicate more frequent consumption. So we're seeing more frequent consumption of low, and foods with less nutritional content, and these are the fruits and vegetables over here, which tend to be very high in cost but less frequently consumed. So obviously there are health and nutrition implications of this work, and policy implications as well. So this sort of moving forward, this ongoing food costing study, we've kept this up. We did a period of food costing with the nutrition workers between 2014 and 2016, and then we started it again in, I think it was late 2017 or early 2018. And what that's enabled us to do is to evaluate food cost trends in the community of Tuktoyaktuk, both before and after a major infrastructure project. So the Inuvik-Tuktoyaktuk Highway, which is the highway linking Inuvik to the Arctic Ocean. This is touted as a sovereignty project by the federal government. But in any case, this highway has been built and now provides year-round access to Tuktoyaktuk by vehicle. And so in selling this highway to community members, proponents indicated that this should reduce food prices, and community members to some degree, I think, because of that, because they thought that the prices would go down, supported the project. But what we see from our data, from this participatory data, is that prices have actually jumped significantly in contrast to those stated expectations. And this is part of the work that Kim Mathieu is doing, graduate student. I can't see who's on here, but maybe you can ask her questions later if she's joined us today. All right. So after the success of that food costing, engaging those nutrition workers in the food costing study, we were all able to move on to a different kind of sub-project, I guess, a community engagement process. And this was, an example where the nutrition workers in all of the communities played a vital role. They helped us to organize and facilitate and do all of they did all of the logistical work to help us run 2 focus groups in each of the communities, and later, sort of when we went back to the communities to organize these community verification sessions. So basically, the idea here was that the IRC was interested in developing food security strategy. And so this engagement process was really, the point of it was to bring together information to try to support that, that strategy development. So the results, the outputs provide a foundation for decision-making and planning in the region, and also helps IRC identify areas for a strategic focus for action on the ground in specific communities. So in terms of the research process, what we did was we had in each community the nutrition worker kind of leading the show, organizing a focus group, recruiting 2 focus groups, recruiting people to come to the focus groups, spreading the word, organizing catering for the events, and other, you know, logistical aspects. Then we basically conducted focus groups, and we conducted a number of interviews as well, transcribed all of the information, coded the information, and then went back to the communities, presented the information back to communities, and verified the data through public presentations and discussion. So this was a major undertaking and involved, you know, flying around to these small communities and spending usually 2 to 4 days, I would say, in each community, engaging with people and running these focus group sessions, and then going back again and verifying the data. So again, having these locally trained workers on the ground who were there, who had a background in the work that we were doing, and who were able to take on this sort of management of the research process was really important, and I would say essential. So just to give you a sense of what came out of that, we were discussing a number of themes. So this is just one of the themes, harvester support. We had talked to the communities about the assets that they have, you know, what kind of infrastructure do they have, programs, resources, capacity, what are the challenges and gaps, and did they have any ideas for possible solutions? And so in this way, this is, you know, just here you see a simplified way of looking at trends across the region, but we were able to understand what the cross-cutting trends were across all communities, and then also the specific community-based trends. And now we're moving towards putting it all together in a detailed report and supporting the food security strategy process. Okay, so from that regional scale work, we've been able to develop our networks at the local scale, and this has led to a newer kind of community scale project with Paulatuk and Tuktoyaktuk to advance community identified priorities that came out of that engagement process. So here, what we've seen is with Tuktoyaktuk, we have been able to build on the food costing work. And again, my master's student, Kim Mathieu, has been leading a collaboration with a youth in Nunavut, building her research capacity. So she runs an Inuvialuit magazine and is really interested in learning about research. So we've been engaging her since last summer, and she's been learning about and contributing to the research process. And now she is conducting food security interviews in both her home community and in Tuktoyaktuk. So we were really fortunate to be able to draw on our existing relationship with the nutrition worker in Tuktoyaktuk. So she sort of took on the role as research facilitator. She organized and scheduled interviews and supported Matea, the youth from Nunavut, during her visit in conducting these interviews. And so we've been able to kind of support this community-based process from afar, which has been really exciting. And in Paulatuk, through our grant, we're supporting a part-time community food security coordinator as an employee of the IRC. So we have someone on the ground there who's coordinating different food security related activities and sort of linking, playing a linking role between programs. And so that's really exciting. And I think there's an additional benefit of having that person in place during COVID, because she can help us to organize and conduct research activities with remote support from us. So yeah, it's been really privilege to work with these nutrition workers. And I hope I've given you a sense of how important this sort of multi-tiered network of relationships at regional and local levels is. And it's enabled us to address priorities at different scales and to move from working more at a regional kind of governance level to more local action-oriented projects. Okay, so I see that time is ticking, but yeah, a few more minutes. All right, so I'm just going to run through this very quickly, but I wanted to give a contrast, a sort of different flavor, and move west a little bit to Kluane First Nation territory and talk about this project that we've been engaged with called Bringing Research Home, reclaiming research to tell the story of climate change in the Kluane First Nation traditional territory. So it stemmed from an ongoing dialogue with KFN, Kluane First Nation, about how to best enhance their ability to actively drive research and participate with researchers and with research that's taking place in the traditional territory. And this partnership has sort of a different dynamic. It's really been driven by the community, and sort of as an academic lead, I'm playing more of a support role. And it's again been really interesting to be involved with. So just to situate you, here's Kluane First Nation territory. It overlaps with the Kluane National Park and Reserve, where there's been a lot of research, natural science research done. It's a really dynamic area, interesting ecosystem. And historically, the local community has really been marginalized in the research process. And so that's what's driving them. You know, they want to know more about the research being done on their territory. And so we've been engaged in this process. There's sort of three key goals, two of them. The first one is compiling, they want to compile all the existing climate change research that's been conducted in their territory. And so we're helping them with that. And then make this research accessible to community members. And so part of what we're doing is creating a new website. And a large part of that website is going to be this interactive kind of online atlas where publications will be collated and categorized. And there will be also an opportunity for local community members to add their own observations of environmental change. And so looking at this as being sort of really interactive feature. And then a third goal is to improve KFN engagement with researchers. And so that process is leading to the development of guidelines for researchers. And I can say quite a bit more about that, but that's also been really interesting. You know, they don't want a checklist. They don't want researchers to have a checklist and just sort of check it off and say, okay, we've done what we need to do. It's, you know, they want researchers to better understand them and their territory and their interests and priorities, and to think about different and creative ways to engage with community members. And I'd be remiss not to mention this sort of parallel process that's going on, these community-driven research summits. They've been sort of taking the bull by the horns and running these research summits, and we've been supporting that as well, bringing researchers into the territory to sit down with community members and share knowledge and perspectives over a 2-day period. And there's been a lot of lessons to be learned and really positive feedback. And we're hoping to run another research summit next year once COVID is no longer so prevalent. So yeah, I hope that gives you a bit of a sense of why these collaborative research relationships are so important. I think we still have significant steps that we need to make as a research community. And you know, from a sort of decision maker, policymaker perspective, I think it's clear that researchers and communities need support. So time, human resources, funding to intentionally spend time together, mending and building relationships and learning from each other in respectful ways that attempts to balance existing power dynamics around knowledge sharing. So here are a few ideas about how we as researchers might approach working with communities. You know, obviously, respect, take the time. These are built on relationships. Listen, don't come in with your your preordained questions, but make sure to listen and be flexible and adaptable. Offer one's skill sets that may have nothing to do with the project, but offer to help and to share and to support communities in achieving and working on the priorities that are of interest to them. Be open to different types of knowledge, and recognize that research will evolve sometimes in very unexpected ways. And so look for those opportunities to support community efforts. Okay, so thanks for your attention, and very happy to answer questions or discuss any of this.
Thank you so much, Professor. That was a fantastic presentation. I know I have lots of questions for you, but I'm going to open it up to the floor first. Did anyone have a question about the presentation or just in general?
I have a question for Sonia, and it's for students wanting to, like, because there's a lot of us that we really want to be involved in the North, but we don't really know where to start. Do you have any suggestions on where, like, a lot of us can, where we can start kind of making those connections and thinking about Indigenous knowledge and how we can apply it and stuff like that? You're on mute. Oh yeah.
Yeah, no. I guess it's challenging. Yes, definitely, because it takes time, right? And I think a good place to start is if you're working with somebody, so a supervisor or a research collaborator who already has some relationships. I think that's a really nice conduit, a way to be, if you can be introduced to somebody, there's that sort of social capital, I guess, that comes into play. I think reading up as much as you can on the people, the territory, the sort of history, trying to understand some of the dynamics. Each community is so different and has a different experience historically, both with colonization and also with research, right? And so I think the more that you can do to understand those dynamics, the better off you are, if you arrive on scene and start building those relationships, you have a foundation. And that said, there are, like Kluwani is developing researcher guidelines, and other communities have these guidelines as well. So I think there are resources out there to give us a starting point as to how to think about these relationships in an ethical way, and how to make contact and who to contact, and who has decision-making power in communities, and how to negotiate cultural challenges, cross-cultural challenges and things like that. So I don't know, there's no clear recipe, I would say, but building on existing relationships is, I think, is key.
Agreed.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Karina, why don't you go ahead?
Thank you. Thank you for this amazing presentation. So I have a similar question to the question that was asked. So as a non-Indigenous woman, did you encounter like barriers while engaging with communities?
Yeah, that's a big question, but definitely, I think that, my experience with working with Indigenous communities began really in 2003. So let's say 15, a bit over, a little bit, I don't know, almost 20 years ago, I guess. Okay, it's been a while. So at that, the landscape has really shifted since then in terms of sort of sensibilities around, Southern researchers' place or role in Northern research. And I think we're on a path. We're still in transition, sort of moving away from more extractive research, where people are going in and sort of taking data and leaving, to much more, we're sort of in a process of more collaborative research. And I think we're moving in a way, a lot of the projects nowadays, have capacity building components, really trying to build the research capacity of Northerners and Northern communities themselves, so that they can drive and run their own research programs, right? So I think yes, I've had many challenges, and a lot of hard learning, I would say. During my PhD, I spent a lot of time in one community, and it was both, it was an amazing experience. I learned so much. It was also really difficult and really challenging in many ways. And so, I'm happy to talk about that at a different time. But I guess if starting out now, it really requires this kind of constant negotiation of, this ethical negotiation of what our, trying to figure out what our role is and how we can support Northerners in moving forward in the ways that they want to, not in the, not always following in ways that might not always align with our thoughts about what the future should look like, right? And so it I think requires one to be humble and to listen and to reflect and to spend the time trying to and try to have open negotiation, open conversations with the people you're working with, and think about sort of the ways that we can best support them, their development, and priorities of the North. So I don't know that that necessarily answers your question, but maybe provides a little bit of fodder for thought.
Awesome. Thank you for that, guys. And we have another question in the chat. So have you found that you would benefit from the ability to speak languages that are native to that region? I won't even try.
That's a really interesting question. I think it really depends on which region and which community you're working with. So there are, for example, language is still very strong in Nunavut, across much of Nunavut, I would say, in many of the remote communities. In the Nunavut settlement region, the Indigenous knowledge is less, it's less used, and there are definitely some elders who, predominantly speak Inuvialuktun in this case, so there are different dialects across the Inuit regions. But in most of the, sort of events and dialogue in communities is conducted in English. So in the ISR, perhaps it's not as much of an issue. In in remote communities in Nunavut, I would say yes, it would be great to have that language capacity. And again, if you're working with First Nation communities, language use, traditional language use varies.
Sydney, go ahead.
Hi, Sonia. Thanks for the presentation. I was just wondering, we obviously have made a lot of communities and incorporate their knowledge. So I'm just wondering, how much of that is actually translated to the policy making side of things, and how much of that research and Indigenous knowledge is actually sort of being used to I guess as a foundation for the changes that we're making.
So you cut out a little bit in the beginning, but I think you were saying that we've made a lot of progress in sort of recognizing the importance of Indigenous knowledge, and then you're asking how that's being translated into policy. Yeah. Again, I would say it depends, scale and location. It varies across regions. I will say that in the Northwest Territories, for example, they've gone through a process of devolution, and it's an interesting relationship there, because you have the Northwest Territories, you have the territorial government that has a mandate, for the entire territory, and then you have the Inuvialuit settlement region, which is a land claim region. It's predominantly in the Northwest Territories. There's sort of a little tiny bit that's in Yukon, but all the communities are located in the Northwest Territories, and it's a self-governing region. And so you have some, GNWT, Government of Northwest Territories, has jurisdiction over certain things in the ISR, and then the Inuvialuit Regional Corporation is the other body that has sort of jurisdiction or mandate around other aspects. So there are these sort of complex layers of regulations and that are in play. But I was going to make the point that I think in the NWT we have some forward-thinking employees, people who are working for that organization, and that are really trying to push towards supporting communities in developing, their own, to developing their own knowledge and, and research programs, and supporting sort of relationship with the land, and thinking about how to incorporate Indigenous knowledge into their policy. So there's, for example, a Sustainable Livelihoods Action Plan that was just put together, and that involved consultation with a huge proportion of communities in the NWT. The government went out and consulted, like physically sat there. They ran it in a really neat way. They would set up a Fort McPherson tent, these canvas tents, and have a stove going, and just have community members come in and chat about what sustainable livelihoods mean to them. They're talking about country food and about harvesting and connection to the land and how to support that. And so they, this is really innovative for a government to do, a territorial government to take on. And so they've gone out and incorporated that and listened to community members and come up with this action plan. So that's one aspect. I would say in like, for example, in Nunavut, the entire territory is under land claim. So there's much more, I guess, impetus for Inuit to be driving, the governance system there. And anyway, different situation there. I think there's, there are attempts to incorporate Indigenous knowledge. Less so probably in the in the provinces.
Right.
So the North, you would see more of that.
Yeah, it's definitely promising to hear. It would be nice to see more of that at like the federal level, but it's definitely good to hear that we're starting to sort of go in that direction.
Yeah, I mean, at the federal level, we did see, for example, the food policy that came out, was it 2019 already? Anyway, the last couple of years, there was a national food policy for Canada that was put out, and they did organize, support, what were they called? Like engagement sessions. They had one for Inuit, one for First Nations, and one for Métis, and then they drew on the results of those engagement sessions. Basically, people came from all over the country to come to Ottawa and sit there for several days and develop a contribution to the food policy process. I don't have a sense of how well the information from those engagement sessions, how much of it ended up in the eventual food policy, but there are attempts being made. We have a ways to go though, and we have this existing system in place that is colonial in nature, and so there's no getting around that. That's that's a key challenge, the key challenge.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Do we have any more questions? Comments? Okay, well, as other people brainstorm, I'm going to ask a question if that would be okay. So I have so many. I'm trying to think of one that's more specific. So I work with the Department of Fisheries and Oceans. As I think you know, I'm in, for those who don't know, I work in Indigenous reconciliation part-time for DFO. And through that, we analyze modern land claims agreements, and we look at different commitments that the department has made to co-management in these different regions. But they're more like umbrella. So like the Kluane Nation, that would be one modern land claim agreement, et cetera, et cetera. They're not as specific to the communities, at least in the North. That's not what I've seen. So I wonder, when it comes to federal jurisdiction and the different kinds of hunting and gathering and versus fishing, for example, because all of the different groups that got, like the different governing groups that handle those things have different mandates. Mm-hmm. So I wonder, like for caribou and trapping and that kind of thing, what would be the differences between that and like, let's say fisheries, and then let's say like local food, like just gathering on the land?
Differences in which sense?
In like the trickle down effect, because I know that parks, for example, they have a mandate of conservation that's quite clearly defined, whereas the department is notoriously bureaucratic. So like when that has a trickle down effect, how does that impact food security?
Yeah, I mean, maybe I'll sort of come at this from a bit of a different angle, and we'll come back to what I mentioned before, which is that you have these sort of different jurisdictions playing a role in any one region, right? And so different regulations apply and can influence hunting and harvesting access to certain traditional food species. So for example, in the ISR, there are 5 species that are on the endangered species list. And so that restricts what can be done with those species. So that, Inuvialuit beneficiaries are allowed to go and hunt caribou, for example, but you're not allowed to sell it. And there's certain sort of regulations around what can be done with it. Whereas fish sort of falls in under a different category and can be used more broadly. It can be sold to non-beneficiaries. It can be commodified or commercialized. And so there's sort of a range of different options for communities, like the Inuluhakta. They started up a char fishery because they, as a way of generating income for the community. And there's some discussion about doing that in other communities as well. And I'm thinking about sort of a Yukon as well. The Yukon context, you have the park, the national park. So Kluane National Park was mandated as a national park back in like the 50s or something. And at the time, basically Indigenous people, so Kluane, it's part of the park is, within Kluane traditional territory. Residents had long used that area for harvesting and hunting. The park came in, the federal government came in, sort of instituted this park and said, okay, no more hunting and harvesting in the park. Don't come into the park. The park is for wilderness. And all of a sudden, there's this huge chunk of territory that the Kluane members were no longer able to access. So that had a huge impact on their food security, right? And their potential to harvest. What we've seen over time, so it took, I think it was sort of 30 or 40 years later during the land claim negotiation process, Kluane, there's sort of not a reconciliation, that's I shouldn't overuse that word, but basically a shift in park policy where there's recognition that this is part of the traditional territory. We need to make sure that Kluane members are welcome here and that they can harvest here. This is part of, their territory. So they've been invited back in. But what we see is that it was now several generations ago that people were comfortable harvesting there. And for so long, they, for many decades were concerned about being basically caught and fined or, worse if they were in the park. So there's sort of this taboo. And now this process of kind of reintegrating Kluane members into the park has been, I guess, a little bit bumpy, but positive overall. I think that the park staff is really trying to improve that relationship. They've gone so far as to organize events and fly everybody into a remote location in the park and kind of, develop relationships, right? And help Kluane members feel like that relationship is there, and there's a collaborative will on the other side. So I don't know, again, if that exactly got at your question, but yeah, the dynamics are so different in each location. And it has an impact.
Yeah.
So maybe I'll mention one other thing. In Nunavut, under the land claim, they have a different agreement around commercialization of country food. So in Nunavut, you can buy and sell caribou and other species. And so you have these migratory species that walk across the border between Nunavut and NWT, and they're treated in one way in Nunavut and one way in NWT, and then they go over to Yukon. It's there's totally different regulations. So it depends on where they're harvested. What you can do with them depends on where they're harvested. So.
No, that's awesome, awesome. And it's interesting that you bring up this idea of like constructing wilderness, right? Like a zoning out a plot of land to then be like, no, this is now a wilderness space. We see that a lot in fisheries as well, because with salmon, the wild population is dwindling on the west coast of Vancouver Island. That's my site. So now it's kind of like, well, what is a wild salmon? What's a hatched salmon? You know, like at what point do we draw these lines where it's like, well, now we're talking about X, but now we're talking about Y. So that's really interesting stuff, Sonia. And thank you so much for your insights. I really appreciate them. They're very eye-opening.
Welcome.
Does anyone else have questions for Sonia?
No questions, but thank you for the presentation, Sonia. Very interesting and impactful.
Great. Glad you enjoyed it.
Okay, great. So I guess that we can cap it there. I just wanted to remind everyone that next week, April 7th at noon, we have Carolyn Witzman, and she's going to be talking about planning for affordable housing, a rights-based approach. So please join us again for the next Lunch and Learn. These have been awesome. We appreciate your support and your contributions by just being here. So thank you so much, everyone. This presentation will be available if anyone wanted to share it with colleagues or anything like that. I think it'll be up on the GEG YouTube.
Yes. Oh, and Sonia left already.
Great.
Oh no, you should.
Nope.
Thank you, Sonia. That was awesome. I really enjoyed your presentation. It was very
Great.
cool.
Thank you. Thanks for the great questions.